Okay, so I'm switching to English now because it is my native language and this video is targeted more toward hearing people who maybe don't know anything about deaf culture or at least don't know a lot. So I'm going to be speaking English with some closed captioning so it's accessible for everyone. For hearing people, spoken language is natural for us, but for deaf people, sign is what's natural. Imagine living in a world where you have no access to the languages that 99% of the world uses. What this means for deaf people in a hearing culture is that they have to rely primarily on written word and interpreters in order to communicate with the hearing people around them. Having barriers to language can be very detrimental for someone who's deaf, for obvious reasons, as well as some that you've probably never thought about before. The Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, requires that all people who use interpretation as their primary form of communication be provided with an interpreter for medical, legal, education, law enforcement, employment, and other such opportunities that are required for their everyday life. Although the ADA requires the interpretation, it leaves it up to the states to determine what is considered an appropriate amount of interpretation or an appropriate certification level or anything like that. For example, how much interpretation training does an interpreter need? Can they be related to the person they're interpreting for? In order to combat some of those issues, the Idaho Council for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing have been working to pass a bill that would require all ASL interpreters for formal events where the ADA requires interpretation to be licensed through a state-specific licensing process. I was able to attend the hearings in February and March of 2015 in order to see the bill make its way through the committees. At these meetings, I was able to hear the incredible stories of how the quality of interpretation has negatively impacted the lives of deaf individuals. One example was of a deaf woman who brought her sick daughter in to see the doctor. She warned them that she needed to have an interpreter, but instead they just provided a nurse who knew some sign. Although the nurse could use some sign, she couldn't understand sign, so the mother couldn't communicate with the doctor about what the daughter's problems were. So she got worse and they had to bring her back, and again they were denied a proper interpreter. Soon the child was so sick that they thought she might die, so they brought her somewhere else and requested a qualified interpreter, and in the same visit they were able to both communicate the issues and save the daughter's life. Another story is about a man who was going in for a performance review with his boss. A hearing coworker who knows some sign was asked to interpret it, but there was so much miscommunication that it led to the worker getting fired. Another example was when a CODA, or child of a deaf adult, was interpreting for their mother and they were told that their mother had cancer. They were really upset about this, so they didn't tell their mother and she didn't know for a significant period after. This is part of why it's really important that children and parents and relatives are not used as interpreters, because there is an emotional bias there, and it's important for an interpreter to be able to be cut off emotionally as far as not changing what they're saying based on how they feel about the situation. These are just a few of the many examples of how improper, unlicensed interpretation can be harmful to people who use sign as their primary communication. This really proves that there's a real need in the deaf community for this bill. Unfortunately, the bill was vetoed by Governor Otter when it reached his desk. However, according to Stephen Snow, the director for the Idaho Council for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing, they're redrafting the bill in order to ease some of the concerns and hopefully get it through the next time. One of the ways they're doing that is by working to join an existing licensure board instead of creating their own in order to reduce costs. Director Snow said that he expects they will resubmit the bill in 2017 with the required changes to see it passed. An interpreter is an extended part of the deaf community, and they're with a deaf individual for the most important and intimate moments of their lives. Births, deaths, job interviews, retiring, education, so many important life events that are witnessed by this person. When an untrained or unqualified interpreter serves that role, it can have severe effects, possibly lasting a lifetime. One of the people I asked questions about this bill was Holly, an interpreter in the Idaho deaf community. She said, "A deaf person's sense of agency, self-reliance, and fund of information is stripped away when the cultural and linguistic bridge in a given situation is compromised. Interpreters as a profession must care about the quality they provide individually and collectively." If you'd like to learn more about this bill, I recommend checking out the Idaho Council for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing Facebook page. I hope you found this nice and informative. Haven't seen y'all in a while. Hey.